Hello and welcome to today's webinar, How to Respond to Thousands of Vulnerabilities with Limited Resources. This event is produced by Actual Tech Media, and our special guests on the event today are our friends from Flashpoint. Thank you so much to our audience out there for joining us on the webinar today. We've got a fascinating event lined up for you here with a live demo. It's going to be really cool. We want this to be educational, as always, with all of our events here at Actual Tech Media. So we encourage your questions during the event. My name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'll be serving as the host on the webinar. As I said, we encourage your questions. You can pose those questions right there in the questions pane of your audience console, and we'll be taking your questions live at the end of the presentation. So get your questions in early. We even have a best question prize to help encourage those questions. I'll talk about that here in just a moment. But first, I want to call your attention there to the Handouts tab. It's there that you'll find 3 different handouts you can download. They're all in PDF format. Simply just click the view button on those, and you can download those to your local system and check those out after the event. There's the product data sheet on VulnDB that you'll learn about during the event here and see a live demo of. There's a resource on why VulnDB. And then finally, the State of Vulnerability Intelligence Report, just updated for mid-year 2022. So make sure that you check that out. And then finally, it's now, one more thing. I do want to mention at the end of the event, we'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card door prize. If you're watching this on demand, of course, that drawing would have already occurred, and the prize terms and conditions can be found right there in your Handouts tab as well. And as I mentioned, we also have our $50 Amazon gift card for the best question on the live event today. The prize winners will be contacted after the event. And the idea with that is simply to, maybe shake some questions loose. If you're not quite sure if you should ask a question, there's something on your mind you're not sure about, maybe during the demo or about the report, we encourage you to ask those questions, and hopefully that best question prize helps a little bit. All right, so with that, it's now my pleasure to bring in our expert presenters today. Welcome to Mr. Brian Martin, who is a vulnerability historian at Flashpoint, and Mr. Ben Haynes, data scientist at Flashpoint. Ben and Brian, it's great to have you on the event. I'll first hand it off to you, Brian. Take it away.
Thank you for that. Hello, everyone. So we're going to briefly talk about how to respond to thousands of vulnerabilities with limited resources. This is based on our aggregation of vulnerability disclosures. Our product or service is called VulnDB, and it is the most comprehensive vulnerability database out there. If you are familiar with CVE, for example, think of that, but much larger, faster, and a lot more data all around. So that's basically what we're using as the foundation for all of this. We're going to talk about the vulnerability landscape, primarily looking at the first half of this year, then how you can use this data to detect and remediate vulnerabilities faster. And then Ben is going to give you a live demo to show you what the platform looks like and how it can be effective for your organization. And then obviously we'll do some Q&A at the end. So the landscape. This is all based on our vulnerability quick view report, which you can download here in the webinar, or you can get it on the Flashpoint website, I'm sure. So looking at the first 2 quarters, the first half of 2022, and comparing it to prior years, you'll see that there's actually a small dip compared to last year. Part of that is that we don't necessarily take a snapshot of the data on the same day. Last year, I think we waited several weeks before we took it. We didn't do it right at July 1st. But one of the interesting things about this is that while the report says that there were 11,860 vulnerabilities aggregated, since then, that number has climbed to over 14,000. So part of what we do is we're continually looking not only for the newly disclosed, but we're going back through other resources. We're looking for historical data. So if a customer says, hey, we use this product, can you monitor it? We're like, sure. Then we have to go try to find the vendor advisories if they have them, the change logs, the bug trackers, the pull requests, the commit histories, anything we can find, and we go through that looking for any past vulnerabilities. So that's why these numbers will continue to grow over time. Looking at the disclosures through that first half of the year, you'll notice that there are several spikes, and those spikes are basically dreadful days for IT and security teams. Most of you may be familiar with Patch Tuesday, the second Tuesday of every month. That's when Microsoft decided they would release all of their patches. But unfortunately, many other vendors jumped on that bandwagon. So you have Adobe, SAP, Siemens. Then you also have other vendors that don't necessarily release on that day, but have in the past. And those are your Mozilla, Google Chrome, Apple, any of the other big vendors. Then there's always the continuous wave of Cisco, F5, etc. The other big day is two of them actually, January 18 and April 19. Those spikes are from Oracle the Oracle quarterly CPU. So they release 4 times a year. You know about them in advance, which is good. You can plan for it. But unfortunately, because they release infrequently, they tend to be up in the 400 vulnerabilities range. And what's interesting about the CPUs is that while that number is really big, the amount of new vulnerabilities is considerably smaller, down in the 120 to 150 range. And so many times they're patching known vulnerabilities. Even though you knew about them, the team still has to respond and go through and patch all of the software in the Oracle portfolio, which can be painful. And then it hasn't happened recently, and it's not going to happen for, I think, another 5 years. But a term we dubbed a while back was the vulnerability through UARA, and that's where Oracle releases on the same day as a Microsoft Patch Tuesday, along with the other vendors. And yeah, those days are a lot of fun for us as well. One of the most frequently asked questions we get is, what's the most vulnerable product, or which vendor has the most vulnerabilities? And while we will answer it, we will also give you a lot of disclaimers. These numbers are kind of interesting, and it answers the question kind of, sort of, but not really, because when you consider like Debian Linux, right? 712 vulnerabilities definitely puts it up there as number 1. But when you install it, how many of those packages are installed by default? That's a very different answer, right? How many of the vulnerabilities are, for example, local denial of service vulnerabilities from the Linux kernel, right? The threat and risk profile is considerably different based on the vulnerability, the subsystem, the module, whatever. So these numbers don't mean a whole lot in that context. And then under that, you'll see OpenSUSE, Ubuntu, and then SUSE, right? And so it's all the different versions of SUSE and their products. But again, they're carrying a lot of the same vulnerabilities across the entire product line, the same Linux kernel vulnerabilities, the same MySQL, whatever, right? And then jumping over to the next one, we see by vendor, pretty much all the ones you would expect. SUSE, Microsoft, Google, Oracle, Dell, Red Hat. Again, these numbers are kind of interesting, but they don't mean a lot, because when you look at that in the context of how big the product portfolio is, just because Microsoft has that many vulnerabilities doesn't mean you're running running all of their software, or especially like Oracle, their product portfolio is insane, and odds are you're running a tiny fraction of it. So just because their name appears on this list doesn't necessarily mean anything for your organization. You have to look at it in the context of, okay, what do we actually run? Now look at how many vulnerabilities affect us. So one of the things we do in the aggregation of the vulnerabilities is we break out all the common bits of it. Your location, what's the impact, what's the software, who found it, the references. But then after that, we also add a lot of metadata. We're pulling out the timeline if one is available. When was the vulnerability discovered, disclosed to the vendor? When did the vendor respond? When did the vendor patch? When was it publicly disclosed? When was an exploit publicly disclosed? Because it may not all be the same dates, right? And those timelines give us some fascinating metadata around the vendors and the products so that we can say which vendors have a good record about patching, because it's not about how many vulnerabilities you have. The vendor may have 1,000 vulnerabilities, and that sounds really bad, but if their average patch time is 5 days, that is exceptionally good. You want that kind of responsive vendor, right? And if you have a vendor that only has, let's say, 100 vulnerabilities, but it takes them 10 months, that means that you have a lot longer of a risk window, right? So using this data, which we call VTEM, vulnerability timeline and exposure metrics, you can look at any product or vendor to figure out, are they responsive? What is the time to patch? Then what is the time to exploit after disclosure? So that you can start to get a better feel for just how urgent you need to patch specific software. I mentioned CVE earlier. If you're not familiar, CVE is a government-funded program run by MITRE that is basically a vulnerability database. However, they operate in a very different manner than we do. They use what they call CNAs, CVE numbering authorities, primarily, one of the two primary ways. And they basically say, hey, Microsoft, you're going to assign your own CVE ID to each vulnerability, and you're going to share that back to us. Once we get it, we'll put it in the database. The other way is that researchers can go straight to MITRE and say, I found a vulnerability, I would like an ID. So it's basically MITRE waiting for everyone to go to them to populate the database. We, on the other hand, are proactive. We are out there looking at sources. We're reading the blogs, we're reading the commits, the bug trackers, we're reading Twitter, we're reading everything we can, trying to find them as soon as they're disclosed so that we are more responsive and that information gets to you quicker to help reduce that window of risk. CVE has a significant intelligence gap. And one of the things that we'll frequently do is compare and say, well, in the first 6 months, we had so many vulnerabilities. What did CVE have? And looking at this chart, we see that there were 20.7% of what we have that have no CVE ID. So if you're using them, you have a big gap in your knowledge. And then on top of that, there was another 6.5% that are in reserve status, meaning that if you go to CVE and you load the ID, it just says reserve. There's no information, no references, nothing. But those are actually still publicly disclosed vulnerabilities with information out there. Those are cases where either the CNA forgot or a researcher got the ID but didn't notify CVE that they got that they had disclosed it. And so it's a second big gap. Overall, 27.3%, that's significant, especially when you consider how many assets are in your organization. One of the other big things that people are talking about are vulnerabilities that are called discovered in the wild. And that means that they are discovered when they're actively being exploited by a threat actor, that there's no other public knowledge of the vulnerability, the vendor's not aware. So a threat actor will find a vulnerability, use it to compromise someone, and that is when it's discovered in the wild, right? Google, their Project Zero team, they track these, and their spreadsheet for tracking it is pretty heavily used, but they admittedly don't track all of them. They track basically the higher profile software, where we try to track everything. One of our core tenets is that we want to aggregate all of the vulnerabilities, regardless of what software, regardless of the severity, and put it in the database so that you can decide what's important to you. Because a vulnerability in some obscure system may not impact you, but it may impact the next organization. And we learned just how wild that can be early on when some significant companies would say, hey, can you monitor this plugin for WordPress? And we're like, really? And yes, they are using these plugins for WordPress on their corporate blogs. So we try not to make any assumptions about that. In doing that, our coverage of discovered in the wild is considerably better. And these are important because they do represent a risk. There's an exploit that is likely public, or if not, it's still being used by threat actors. It is likely to become public very quick, and there is no solution generally, no patch, no upgrade. And that's when the vendors have to scramble to get something out, some kind of remediation. So having quick knowledge of these allows you to better react to say, okay, we need to change our IDS, we need to change our access control list, we need to be on the lookout for this, maybe we need to temporarily disable whatever. The more knowledge you have, the better you can make those decisions. And then the last bit here, this is kind of the sweet spot that we look at. We're doing a chart that shows which vulnerabilities have a solution, like a patch or an upgrade, which ones also have a public exploit, meaning you're at higher risk of being exploited, and which ones are remotely exploitable. So get rid of the local, the wireless, physical access, get rid of those, and then which have all three attributes. And in the first half of this year, there was just over 2,000. These are the ones that have the best bang for buck, that if you remediate those, you will significantly reduce your risk. These are the ones that we recommend you get on right away, just because they are at more a bigger chance of being exploited and impacting your organization. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Ben.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. So Brian gave a really good summary of trends and information we've seen so far in the first half of this year, and some good insight into like the state of the industry a little bit, and practices and principles we have on the VulnDB team. I'm going to try to focus more on like literally what does the product do, how do clients use it, and stuff like that. And of course, I'll touch on some of the trending and stuff as well. But first, I want to summarize VulnDB as a whole. I want to scope out of just the first half of the year and talk about what's really in VulnDB. So first of all, there's nearly 300,000 vulnerabilities in our database, and that's a lot. In fact, when we talk about how to respond to thousands of vulns with limited resources, the first thing you don't want to hear is that there's actually more vulnerabilities that you even knew about in the first place. And what's great is that, like Brian has been talking about, and like he showed in that Venn diagram, is you can use the contextual and meta information we provide on the vulnerabilities to really filter out those things. So having a clearer, bigger picture is not a bad thing, as long as you also have the tools to funnel it down to exactly what you need to actually be looking at, which is what we have, right? So that's, 300,000 is great. And then, like he mentioned, about a third of that, the first half of the year was more like 20-something%, but about a third of it in total, 94,000, don't have CVE IDs at all. So these are cases where that vulnerability isn't currently in CVE, and just about in every case will not be in CVE, but they are in VulnDB. And there's a lot of reasons why that is. We'll maybe talk about that more later when I actually show you them. And then the rest of this is more or less a quick summary of what I'm hoping to show you in the demo, right? That what because CVE is missing them, and because everything relies on CVE, that pretty much any tool is missing that big chunk of information, or at least the metadata or the security perspective on that information. And yet, 40% of those that are missing in CVE are high or critical. They have exploits, they have solutions, they affect major and minor products. There's really no single reason why you would ignore all of that, and yet people do systematically ignore all of those just because they're over-reliant on the CVE process. So I like to think about VulnDB as, or the strengths of VulnDB as having 3 dimensions. And one of those is more, right? There are more vulnerabilities, and that's kind of what we've been speaking to. There's a bunch of stuff not covered in CVE, and then our coverage of technologies is really good too. And Brian has touched on this a little bit, but COTS, IT, OT, libraries, hardware, software, you name it, right? If it can have a vulnerability and that vulnerability could be remediated by you at the end of the day if you wanted to, then we want to cover that within VulnDB. And we want you to be able to find it. And we treat them all the same. Our schema, our approach, our principles apply to all of these things, whether or not they have a CVE ID or not, whether or not they're hardware or not. And what that means is you can have a holistic view of all of these things like we do, and not have to bucketize or think about vulns differently depending on what team you're on or what type of product you're interested in. And that consistency creates a single pane of glass, single source of truth, however you want to describe it, for vulnerability information. And that's really great. The second dimension that is cool is the speed of it all. So when we say that we have more vulnerabilities and there's actually a lot more depth, your first thought might be that, well, then it's going to take longer because you got to do more work. And the reality is that it doesn't. It may have ended up being the case, but it doesn't. And Brian gave a good overview of why that is. It's because the CVE and NVD process just gets really bogged down. It puts a lot of, it puts the wrong onus on the researcher, and it also puts some of the wrong onus on CVE themselves. And so it just becomes a bit of a mess. Another part of that is that we just really like vulnerabilities. We care about vulnerabilities. And so we feel strongly that we want to report them to the best of our ability as quickly as we reasonably can. Follow trails to their natural end, get all the information we can for our clients. And so we end up really, keeping up with that database. And as Brian likes to say, VulnDB is a living database. It lives, it breathes. We add 60, 70 new vulns into it a day, but we're changing hundreds of vulnerabilities. When an exploit comes out, when a solution comes out, when we find a YouTube video that demonstrates how that vulnerability is exploited, when we find some obscure blog post that lists yet another product that log4j effects, we are adding those into VulnDB constantly and all the time. So you might learn about a new vuln in your environment, and that's not actually a new vuln. It came out 5 years ago, but the fact that it affects something you use is a new piece of information. And that's a level of granularity that's just as important. As far as you're concerned, that is a new vuln in your organization. And yet, if you're waiting on a scan to have a signature, to have a CVE ID to be disclosed by a vendor, you're way too far downstream of that. And it's also totally impenetrable to you how that happens and where the data is. You can't ask them questions. You can't drill down onto it. Whereas with VulnDB in our research process, you really can. And that lag time, or one manifestation of that lag time between how we publish a vulnerability and how you might see it in NVD is, like Brian said, that reserved status. So an ID might be reserved for use, and it might even be in use, but CVE hasn't caught on to that fact yet, and yet we have. And so these are cases where, it's a patch Tuesday and there's a lot of vulnerabilities that just came out from Microsoft, let's say, and you can read all the Microsoft advisories, but they might be kind of hard to parse. Well, we will parse them and make them programmatic and well-structured and stuff for you to search through and filter on and get alerted on and all of this before CVE even says a word about Microsoft in any of those entries. And it'll take them a week, sometimes 2 weeks. Sometimes I see cases where it's taken months or years, or it seems like CVEs have been totally abandoned by CVE. And again, if you're relying on CVE as a data set, then you wouldn't ever notice that those things were abandoned. But because we're running this parallel process and trying to do the best job that we can, we notice all of these shortcomings. And then we notice these shortcomings manifesting in other products or other data sources who are relying on CVE, because they're affected downstream from CVE's failure. So that's the faster piece of it. Our process and our passion and our motivation just drives outcomes faster. And that is just true, right? But if you were to do analysis of our data, or you ever wanted to talk about that, I could talk your ears off about how true that is in different cases of that happening. Okay, and then the last dimension of all of this is the depth of it. It's not just that there's more, it's not just that they come to you faster, but it's also, they're so much deeper. When you look at NVD, what you see is CVSS scores, and you see what's affected, basically. There's also some CWEs, and there might be some keywords in a description you could pick up on. But programmatically, you see CVSS scores. But we track not just CVSS, but over 60 different classifications Does it have a solution? What kind of solution? How is this thing disclosed? Was it a 0-day or discovered in the wild, like Brian had mentioned? And those give you like a lot of knobs that you can turn and tune to exactly what you are interested in. You might have a lot of technologies in the organization, so you want a lot of knobs so that you can fine tune each one, so that instead of getting bombarded with vulnerabilities, you're just told about the 5 that check all 10 of your boxes. Now, if you're an organization that just has 50 libraries or 50 packages or 50 pieces of hardware or something that you need to secure, then you have a larger appetite for vulnerabilities. You could probably actually deal with more because your basis is smaller. And so you might let up on those knobs a little bit and have fewer qualifiers, right? But the bottom line is that's up to you in VulnDB. You can have, the most beautifully crafted kind of crystalline scheme by which, or gauntlet that a vulnerability would have to go through before reaching your desk. Or it could be as simple as like, tell me about Microsoft. I'm a Microsoft guy, right? So you can go, anywhere in between there, and the depth of the data is what helps with that. And then the other piece of this that's just kind of an obvious thing is obviously we're going to tell you how to fix it, right? So at the end of the day, when we say we have a lot more and we're getting it to you fast and it's going to be the right thing, we also say, and by the way, patch to 1.2 or this thing isn't getting a fix even. We'll say something like that. So hopefully that didn't spoil too much of the fun of the demo. I'm actually show you some examples and how it works in VulnDB. But I wanted to summarize conceptually why I think VulnDB is such a cool set of data and such a cool product. All right. Just going to go to the next slide here. So another great thing about VulnDB, and it might be obvious from what I said, or it might not be, is that it serves a lot of different personas across any organization. So like I said, we have coverage of IT, OT, libraries, software, hardware, whatever, right? So no matter if you're an organization that's more like energy focused or something like that, or you're a financial institution who just uses, shoots out a lot of laptop images for new employees, or whether you're government or whoever it might be, you might care about different vulnerability. You might care about different types of products that vulnerabilities affect. That's what the words I was trying to get at. And so we got you covered, right? So that might cover product security versus DevSecOps versus a more straightforward vulnerability management versus physical security. But also, I really harped on the speed of it all and how quickly we can tell you about new vulns or how quickly we'll have good information on vulnerabilities. And I see that personally really flourishing in the incident response space. I've talked to clients who consider a high-profile vulnerability like Log4j to be an incident. Not even knowing that it's in the organization is an incident, but just knowing it's out there, that it's kind of an existential threat. And so being able to just go into VulnDB and say, well, what's the latest on it is really, really powerful. And then, if you've tuned everything properly, it won't be a matter of learning about it elsewhere and going into VulnDB. VulnDB will be your first and last stop to learning about that vulnerability. And that's always really cool to see as well. And then finally, what I'll mention on some of these like things like third-party risk and CTI and some of that stuff is not only do we have integrations into the FP Tools Flashpoint threat data from VulnDB, but also we give you some strategic information on top of the tactical. So something like, here's a vuln, it's bad, here's how to fix it is very tactical information for you to go whack that mole today. But we want people to be pulled out of the whack-a-mole game. And we want to give you strategic information that says, you've been really working hard to fix this thing constantly. It's because that product overall has problems. And that's a more strategic question of, do we keep using that product? Do we dedicate more resources to it and so on? And that can really help with like procurement or third-party risk or whatever. And that's a little bit more high level. It's a little meta, but it's also something that's enabled by the granularity and the expertise in our data. Okay. All right. So I've talked enough about that. Let me move into the demo and start talking about the actual problem. And to do that, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so this is VulnDB. One thing I'll call out right up front is that I think of VulnDB like the data set. I think about it like the actual uh, abstract set of data that we care very deeply about. And what we've been generally talking about in this presentation is how good the data is. It's faster. There's a lot more of it. And there's actually really two, maybe three ways you can get that data. One of it is through our API. We have a RESTful API that you can pull all of this data down locally and parse through it and do your own processing on it. We also have integrations into things like ServiceNow or Splunk or Dependency Track even, where you can see our data in those places that you maybe already have asset information or that you might be familiar with. And that just leverages our API, so that's kind of a half case. But then also we have this portal. And this portal is a way to like set up alerts and do searches, and it's much more visual. So this is how we do demos, and this is kind of what I'm going to demo for you today is the power of VulnDB here. So the first thing you see when you sign into VulnDB is not just kind of a summary of some numbers we already saw in the slides up front, but also we have some of the most recently published vulnerabilities. So like we've been talking about, we're constantly churning vulns into the database. Here are things from today or yesterday that have come across our research team and published into the database. I recognize Cisco, obviously, or even this Oraton 23 product, Delta. And even within this, you can see there's, Cisco, this might be a firmware, it might be a piece of hardware. I'm not too familiar with it, but also there's libraries here. Delta Electronics sounds a little bit like an OT thing to me, but it has to do with cryptography. So anyway, so that gives you a glimpse of the sort of things we're constantly churning through. And then here are my latest alerts. So these are alerts I've set up that I'm going to be looking at in general. So these are things that I've at some point said, I care about that. Like I have some URLs I monitor, for example, and we'll do like a passive scan of the URL to say what's running on it. Like Brian mentioned WordPress plugins or something, for example. So if your website's running a WordPress plugin and a vulnerability comes out in that WordPress plugin, we can tie those two together and say that website has that vulnerability. And I get alerted on that, right? So it looks like there was one in some applet that's running on the AWS site, for example. And then I'm subscribed to things like OpenSSL, MySQL, the Big IP products, stuff like that. And then I can look into those vulnerabilities, and I'll show you what that kind of information looks like in a second. What I really want to do, though, is I want to start talking about the granularity, and how I usually like showing that is through this advanced search. So if you're me, or if you're like me and you like digging through data like this, you'll want to search on it. You'll want to say, well, what's new today? What was new yesterday? What's happened in the last year? Who's the biggest, most vulnerable vendor, and all of this stuff. And the gateway for asking those questions is through the advanced search. So there's a lot of different fields here that really show off the kinds of things we collect. So there's like keywords. I can type in here remote code execution, right? And that'll show me all of the remote code execution vulnerabilities if that's something that I really care about. I can type in ransomware. I can type in COVID-19, and it will show me vulnerabilities that are in like contact tracing apps or other vulnerabilities that relate to the pandemic and stuff like that. So those keywords can be really important or really valuable or interesting to certain people, depending on who you are. And then also we have things like what is actually affected. So I can say, well, I want to see Windows 10, right? And then obviously I can do this in combination. I can say, I want remote code execution Windows 10 vulnerability, and so on here too, right? So there's severity scoring, CVSS, and then there's also these classifications. So this is part of what Brian was talking about, and it's what I was saying when we say we have 60 or so classifications or whatever. These are boxes we check on every vulnerability to confirm or fail to confirm certain facts about it. So for example, we'll say if an exploit is public, or if it's being bought and sold as some commercial framework, or if it's just a POC. But if we don't see any exploit information, we don't just leave it blank and have plausible deniability or something. We say it's unknown. We actually say, we looked and there wasn't anything. There was nothing that came across our desk about this exploit-wise. So exploit is unknown. Same thing with impact. What part of the CIA triad does this thing touch, or do we not know? What kind of solution is out there, or maybe there isn't one, right? And there's a lot of good use cases embedded within each of these. For example, most of the time you'll have a patch or you'll have an upgrade as a solution, but we also have things like discontinued product, which gives context to the fact that there is no solution, meaning the vendor isn't going to fix that vulnerability. because it's end of life or something like that, it's discontinued. And so that's going to enter into your risk equation of whether or not you even still use that product anymore, you buy a newer model, or you write an angry letter to the vendor, whatever the case may be. We have that information. But also we'll say things like there is a third-party solution. So you can say things like there is no solution first party from the vendor because it's end of life. However, there is an alternative if you're willing to trust it. And we don't make that decision for you. It's up to you to weigh that against your risk appetite and say, you know what, this thing's bad enough that I'm okay with taking a third party solution versus no, I don't want to risk it. I don't trust the third party. It's really up to the vendor, and it's the vendor's fault. This thing doesn't have a fault. So I want to stick it to them instead. So that's where we just try to give you as much information possible to make these decisions. And then, like I said before, if you look over these and you say, I really care about 0 days, I care about things with public exploits, I care about a loss of confidentiality because that would mean extracting my data and having some kind of data breach. I care about things that are remotely exploitable, right? Or things that don't require authentication. If that's like your nightmare scenario, is those 5 boxes being checked, and you can check those boxes and be alerted on them. And that turns 300,000 vulnerabilities into, off the top of my head, let's call it 10,000 vulnerabilities. And that's a great reduction. And then you don't even have all 10,000 of those vulns. That's just the 10,000 that are out there. So if you scrunch that further into just the things that affect what I'm running in my environment, you might only be dealing with 500 vulnerabilities. And that's so much more manageable. That's, relatively speaking, a bite-sized chunk for you. And then that can be sorted or filtered on sub-conditions like what the CVSS score is or how old it is, whatever it is that you care about. And working with so many different clients over the years, what I know about, everyone's organization is everyone's so different. And it all depends on how many fires are going on or what you've prioritized or your history. So we just want to give everyone as much information as possible and then give you the tools to make informed decisions based on that. And all of the fields in this advanced search are a way of doing that. Right. Okay. So let me show you a couple more things here before we sort of transition into this deep dive of the kinds of things we collect. One thing I want to point out, just to sort of prove it because we keep saying it, is the things that CVE is missing. So what we mean by that is if you wanted to find a vulnerability that had a certain CVE ID, I could say, show me CVE, 2019 0708. I think that's Bluekeep. I think that's Bluekeep, right? I could do that. But what I could also do is I could say, show me things that don't have a CVE reference. So these are cases where it went all the way through our research process, passed through many sets of eyes and hands, and at no point in that process were we able to correlate a known vulnerability to a known CVE ID, right? And that's where this list of about 100,000, about a third of our database comes from. And I can easily search for those and look, it's 95,000. We're going to hit 100,000 at the end of this year, maybe early next. And you can see the kinds of things that they're in. It's a lot of libraries, but there's also some things you'll recognize here, like Apache, Amazon, Azure, GNU, GhostScript. There's even some Windows things here. This is changing every day, so I just am sort of calling out the things that I recognize personally. And you'll notice there's no, these are 10s and 7s and some 4s and some 5s and some 9s. And if you look at the time period, I know this is probably really small on your screen, but there was 3,500 so far this year, almost 10,000 last year, 7,500 the year before that. This isn't a new problem. It's not going away. And yet, again, if you're relying on CVE and that CVE NVD process or that data downstream from your vendors, then you're missing all of that stuff. You're just not being told about it. That's really, really rough. That's one thing I wanted to point out. 2 other things that I really love about VulnDB, and these were just cool little tricks I've learned with VulnDB that have helped me analyze data or get to the bottom of what customers want or how to address a vulnerability. One of them is like just searching on a reference that isn't a CVE ID more generically. So for example, I'm sure we've all heard of the CISA known exploited vulnerability list. If you put that list in here, and I'm not going to type out the whole thing because this takes a partial string. If I just put a partial string in here for that known exploited vulnerabilities list, what that's doing is it's searching our database for all of the vulnerabilities that cite that list. And when a vuln gets added to that list, we make sure it's cited within the vulnerability information. So you can see here's the 844 that are all listed. And again, each of these have a CVSS score in all of those classifications. So for example, if I click this graph results button, what it'll do is it'll roll up all of these 844, and it'll tell me on average what they are. They affect Microsoft predominantly, but there's also a lot of Ubuntu, canonical stuff, Gentoo, Red Hat, a lot of Linux things, it seems, Dell, Oracle, right? And then I can look and see about half of them are remotely exploitable. Most of them affect integrity. Looks like about 90% of them have solutions, meaning you could go take action, but some of them don't, right? So that's my way of showing you all of these without having to click each individual one to prove out that they have all of this great contextual data in them. But that's one cool thing that I can now set an alert on this. Next time a vulnerability gets into the KEV list and I want to see that really rich, beautiful VulnDB point of view on it, I can just add a what we call search alert and type in, KEV list vulns or something like that. Another thing that I like about the advanced search is like on a Patch Tuesday. So if you're someone who's working on spreadsheets or something, scraping all the data from the Microsoft advisories and trying to sort through that, which sounds like a mess, but I've seen it more than twice, more than 3 times, many times. Another thing I like doing here is just saying release note, and this again is a partial string of where Microsoft puts all of their advisories, in this case for the month of August. So again, if you're looking at that Microsoft disclosure for August or July or June or whatever it is, you pop that into our reference search, it'll show you all of the vulnerabilities that came out of that. Another thing I like doing is if someone sends me a news article about vulnerabilities, I'll search on the news article. And if it's in Ars Technica or something, I search on that thing and we'll probably cite it in the vulnerability that the news article is writing about. So, the article probably doesn't go into a lot of technical detail, but I want to know because I'm a bit of a nerd. So I'll search that in VulnDB, and then I can see all those vulns come up that the article is talking about, and I can get the real deep dive technical details on it too there, which is just really, really cool. Okay, so that's a little bit about like functionally how you can get a lot of good, easy value out of VulnDB just by being creative and thinking about what do I care about, what do I come across, what do I want to know about, and using the depth of the data we collect to dig into it all. Right? Now, I want to show you a couple of vulnerability records and a few ways that this stuff manifests, like what it actually looks like when you click on a vuln. So this is a more recent one, I guess, from that August advisory. I want to show you something that I was looking at earlier today, though. This is a vulnerability that I saw in VMware, and I liked it for a few reasons, and I want to just highlight what those reasons are, right? So in all of those results that I get, if you click on it, you'll see something like this, a vulnerability record that looks quite like this. And again, in the API, you can get all this data too and do these same searches basically. It's just not as visual if I were to be scrolling through like JSON throughout this webinar. So I'm not doing that. But you can see here some things that we call out, right? So it's a local privilege escalation vulnerability. It's a 6.9 CVSS score. It is a local vuln. It's not remote. That might contribute to why it's not higher as far as CVSS. It has a solution, pretty straightforward. We're not aware of any exploit information for it. And then we also call out here what we have is our social risk score. So this is something we collect based on, are people talking about the vulnerability or not? Is this a high, medium, or low? If everyone, on Twitter is tweeting about it or it's in the news, then it's going to be high, right? So I would bet you if I pulled up log4j, it would still even now be a high. But this is a vulnerability from yesterday or the day before that's already reached to a medium. So because I kind of know the inner workings of social risk score, I actually think that's pretty impressive. Things don't catch that much momentum so quickly unless they're a big deal or going to be a big deal. So this is the reason this caught my eye, for example. So that's another great contextual piece of information that's here. Now, another thing that's interesting is I mentioned that we have integrations or touch points between us and the FP Tools threat intelligence data. So this little Flashpoint icon, this little flame, I can click, and that'll push me into FP Tools and show me like mention data on this particular vulnerability. And right now, because it's new and there's not been like a lot of really interesting conversation about it, there's only a couple mentions here, but I think even within the last hour or two, there have been some other things. I don't exactly know what that says, but you can see some of these mentions on Telegram or otherwise about the vulnerability. So when I first looked at this, there was not much at all. When I looked at it this morning, there was only 2 mentions, I think. There's already been 2 or 3 more since then. So you can see how this is starting to pick up. how you can use those connections to understand how big this vulnerability may be, who's talking about it, why, and dig into all of that. And then I'm not going to go through every detail of this record, because if I did, I could spend all day talking about this and many other vuln records in the database. It's all really great information. But I just want to highlight, here are some of those classification boxes we check. Here's our listing of what this vulnerability affects. So really, it's in VMware. That's sort of the flagship thing affected. But if that's rolled into Debian Linux by default, then we list Debian Linux too. So we capture those interdependencies. And that's really, really helpful for something like Log4j or a library vulnerability where it manifests in so many, thousands of different products. We'll list them all. When a vulnerability comes out in Samba, that's in a library, but Samba is in Windows and it's in a bunch of other things too. So you might think you're not affected because you don't use Windows, but the reality is that package is rolled into other Linux distro-specific operating systems sometimes, right? So that's pretty interesting, and you can see called out in green what the fixing versions are for some of these branches and so on. And then we also list package information. If this affected any more open source languages like Ruby or Python, we'd have those listed. And then here's the citations we have. So in this case, this thing does have a CVE ID, but there's also like advisories, mailing lists. And then you'll see our severity, our CVSS scoring, a change log that calls out anything that's changed on the vulnerability since it's been published through. Like I said, living, breathing database. And then, what's interesting about this is if you go look at what NVD has to say, it's still awaiting analysis. So even though they've got like a 1-2 sentence description, there's no CVSS score, no CWEs, no affected configurations or CPEs. It's pretty chintzy, right? So this is why VulnDB is so great. If I've hyped this up enough, you're thinking, well, I want to go look at this thing. Well, if you were to go look in NVD, you wouldn't find much on it, right? So having this all searchable and in the same place is really fantastic. So there's one last thing I wanted to mention, and it's just that that's all tactical, right? The what is the vuln, how is it affected? But for example, you can dig into, and I could have clicked on VMware, but I always pick on Android because I think it's an interesting pattern. We have a lot of ratings and metrics on the product itself. So vulns exist in versions which belong to products which belong to vendors. So you can look across any of those levels to say, what are the vulns in this version? What are the vulns in this product? How bad are the vulns in that product? How does that reflect on the product as a whole? And so this is a more, higher level, 1,000-foot view, strategic piece of insight into a particular product based on, in this case, about 3,000 vulnerabilities. So with that, I've given you a fair chunk of VulnDB, maybe not the whole thing, and I'm happy to take any questions we have in the last few minutes we have here.
Thank you so much, Ben. A really cool demo, a really excellent presentation there from Brian as well. I'll bring Brian in as well here for our Q&A. While we take those questions from the audience, I just want to bring up this poll for everyone out there on the screen. We do want to get your feedback on this. The poll question is, what additional information would you like about the Flashpoint solution? And you can select one or multiple options on there. If you'd like your own personal demo, you'd like to try this out for yourself, perhaps, or you'd like a copy of the State of Vulnerability Intelligence Report, just select the option there on the screen. The experts from Flashpoint have been answering questions I see here, during the event. Thank you, Brian, for answering as many of those as you had time for. We've received lots of great questions. So if you have a question, now is the time to get it in. I'm going to go ahead and start with this one from Paul, who's asking, can VulnDB address vulnerabilities related to fulfilling compliance requirements like HIPAA, PCI DSS, and so on?
I'm actually typing the answer to that one right now.
Oh. Okay. Well, I'll let you.
Do you want to speak it, Brian?
Yeah. So the answer is absolutely. Technically, it can help with any compliance framework because we operate kind of at a lower level than that. We aggregate and normalize the vulnerabilities for your organization. You patch them, then you seek compliance. So for us, it doesn't matter if it's HIPAA, PCI, SARBOX, whatever. And as I mentioned earlier, one of our goals is that we try to aggregate all the vulnerabilities. We don't care what. So we are better suited to help you reach compliance over someone like CVE who has some significant blind spots in certain areas. They have like almost no blockchain coverage. They have really poor medical coverage, really poor SCADA coverage, and so on, right? And one more big one, third-party libraries. They have horrible coverage there, right? Where we actively go try to fill those voids, looking at vendors in those spaces. So the answer is yes, but not in a direct manner.
Got it. Okay, excellent. Let's see, another good question here. Does Flashpoint partner with security awareness platforms to amplify the impact of VulnDB in an organization?
That one
I think the answer to that is, yeah, I think the answer to that one is yes. I might be not entirely clear on the definition of security awareness platforms. But as far as making sure that an organization, when VulnDB is in an organization, making sure people know that it is impactful is kind of how I interpret that question, right? And yeah, I've been personally involved with that where, our data might be in a database somewhere, but then it's kind of like what do we do with it from here? You kind of have a question about implementation and what we're taking care of. And yeah, I've been involved with helping people with that. And then on top of that, if you think about an Archer, a ServiceNow, a Splunk, or something we have integrations into, if you have a Splunk instance or a ServiceNow instance that has CIs in it or VITs or whatever you want to call them, the vulnerability response module, we can play by those rules too. We put our data in those places so that if those things have visibility, we can piggyback off of that. I certainly believe that a piece of information is only as good as it is communicated, right? If it's not communicated or displayed or articulated well enough, it's as good as useless sometimes. So I really like not just the fundamentals of is the data there, but also how do we visualize it? How do we really listen to what you care about and then repeat back, okay, good, we have 1,200 of those and 4 of them you need to work on tomorrow, right? Those are really important.
Got it. Okay, excellent. Another question they're asking, do you have any additional resources or any suggestions for resources for companies with limited resources that want to address vulnerabilities discovered through VulnDB? So they find vulnerabilities with VulnDB, and then I guess the question is, you don't have a lot of staff, perhaps. Any suggestions for those folks out there that aren't quite sure what to do with the vulnerabilities that are found?
I mean, I think either of us can take this, Brian. Do you want to try?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's a give and take there, right? I certainly have my own opinions on what a person should prioritize or find useful. And sometimes our clients do kind of want our expertise as people who have a lot of time in the industry. And I'm not shy about giving that as just a, hey, this seems logical or this seems like what people are doing. But also, sometimes I like to understand, what have you as an organization prioritized or had issues with in the past, and how can we dovetail those things? So that's sort of sounds like a non-answer. It's sort of if you're strongly opinionated, then I'm along for the ride, and if you're not, then I've got some ideas too.
Okay, excellent. Here's another interesting question. Does VulnDB score CVSS v2 or v3?
So
that's a good question. So,
yeah,
you want to go ahead, Brian? Go for it.
Yeah, and it's a well-timed question because of something that just happened. So we score both CVSS v2 and v3. We are purist, meaning we follow the CVSS specs very closely, which a lot of organizations don't. Oftentimes, even the big vendors, your Microsoft, well, not Microsoft, but Oracle and such, they don't follow the guidelines very well. Their scores are off, and obviously that'll lead to kind of inaccurate risk ratings that may poorly influence you. We've been talking a little bit about CVE and NVD. NVD is the one that generates CVSS scores for the CVE entries. And just recently, they decided they're going to stop publishing V2 scores. So they're V3 only. And some of you may think, well, Isn't V2 old? Yes, but it's also still widely used. I think it's very short-sighted for them to stop publishing V2 at this point. And then we're also already reading up on the proposed V4 standards. I'm not sure when they're going to come out, but when they do, we'll be scoring V4 as well, I'm sure.
Excellent. Good clarification there. Thank you. Another question, they want to know, how does the API work?
Yeah, that's a big question to answer. It's we get into the details when we need to, but I'll describe it in concept, right? So, like I mentioned, it's a data set. It's just a lot of data. So, especially for organizations who are a little sensitive about the kinds of questions they want to ask, maybe they don't want anyone to know what they consider a priority. They just want to pull the data and have it just be an agnostic, give me everything. You can do that. So we have clients who will have that in a database locally, have it in a Splunk index locally, and then they're actually querying against that local copy in a way that's totally opaque to anybody. That just sort of mirrors our schema a little bit. And we more or less just let you do that when you start implementing VulnDB, mirror that. And then what you really do over time is just grab all the deltas. You grab whatever's new or changed every day or every hour, however often you want it. And then you can make those changes to your local copy. And what's really cool about that is once you've got a local copy of the data, I mean, you are limited to your imagination as far as filtering, searching, querying, put it in your own dashboard, whatever, right? So that's a little bit heavier lift. It requires something a little bit more technical. But I do notice our bigger, maybe more financial clients or our DevSecOps clients like doing that because they want the opaqueness and they're used to developing things. They're not afraid of it. And yeah, we're not afraid of that either.
Excellent. Thank you. Here's another good question. They want to know, are there any trends that you've noticed in VTEM?
Yeah. My camera's freaking out on my side a little bit. I'm sorry if anyone else can see that. But yes, so something that Brian showed earlier in the slides is just that the time, so we track dates, right? We track dates around when a vulnerability came out, when the solution came out, and eventually when an exploit came out. And what we notice is that interval is shrinking, which as a whole, I'm just going to turn my camera off in case that's distracting. Sorry. But as a whole, that time interval is shrinking from the time of the vulnerability being out to an exploit coming out. And that sounds scary, but the reality is one piece of that timeline is how quickly solutions come out. Like you need the solution to come out, and then usually the exploit comes out after. So even though that timeline is shrinking, what's driving that timeline to shrink is that solutions come out faster. So, and on a whole, exploits aren't coming out faster. They're not coming out slower, but they're not coming out faster. So while that timeline does shrink, it really is just giving security teams more opportunity to get ahead of the exploits. It's not a case where things are getting worse necessarily, but it does emphasize how much more prepared people need to be when they're trying to remediate in some exploit-driven way.
Got it.
And
Okay.
I think we recently, Flashpoint put out I just want to mention, Flashpoint put out a blog post where we have some interesting visuals and breakdowns on all of this. And I'm sure if you're interested in that, you could give someone a shout out and they'll direct you to that. That it goes into a lot of depth about that pattern.
Excellent. Well, I know we are running out of time here in our webinar event. We've got just 1 minute left. I do want to remind everyone before we wrap up, don't forget about the poll question that's there on the screen. We do still want to get your feedback on that, what additional information you'd like about the Flashpoint solution and VulnDB. And final question I want to ask one of you is how should folks get started? If they're interested in VulnDB, what's the next step?
What I would say is go to flashpoint.io, and there should be a big and fairly obvious button or something that says request a demo or request a trial. And if you go through there, you'll reach someone like me, or maybe even me, along the way, and we can answer any questions you might have.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ben and Brian. Really great presentation, a really cool demo. Thanks for being on the event today.
Yep. Thank you, David.
Thank you, everyone.
And of course, thank you to Flashpoint for supporting us on the event today. I learned a lot. This sounds like a great solution that could help so many companies out there to be more secure and do it really rapidly, do it more efficiently and much more rapidly than ever before. I encourage everyone to check out the handouts tab there before you go. Don't forget about those 3 PDF resources that you can download. Check out the State of Vulnerability Intelligence Report, just recently updated, and also the Flashpoint VulnDB product data sheet and why you should consider using VulnDB in your organization. Some great resources. Before we go, I do want to announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card door prize. This is going out to Ethan Beach from Arizona. Congratulations. We'll be reaching out to you, as well as our best question prize winner from today's event. Thanks for joining us on this webinar on how to respond to thousands of vulnerabilities with limited resources, brought to you by Flashpoint. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.